How does Austrian economics contribute to a radically more effective business strategy? Last week, Matt McCaffrey identified the strategy framework. This week, he enumerates the principles underpinning it.
This is the Economics for Business podcast. We are here to help all businesses become champions for customers and value, improving lives with preferred and innovative products and services. We offer you the knowledge and tools to make your entrepreneurial journey a successful one. Now, here's your host, Hunter Hastings.
Hi, Hunter Hastings here. We're on a mission to demonstrate why everyone in business should develop an understanding of Austrian economics to inform their strategic thinking and decision-making. As Joe Matarese said in episode 126, Austrian economics just works for business. Why? As a consequence of the entrepreneurial method. As Matt McCaffrey described last week in episode 127, the value logic of Austrian economics leads to a new strategic approach to business, not taught in business school. We call it explore and expand. The starting point is the firm, the vehicle for entrepreneurial action. We talked about the dynamics of the flow model of capital and the process view of markets. And we identified 4 points of difference in approaching strategy. 1, learning, rather than design based on analytics. Experiment and learn, rather than strategize and advance. 2, dispersion rather than centralization. Don't have the head office or the C-suite people do strategy. Let frontline employees interacting with customers and markets learn how to adapt and teach everybody else. 3, implement. Don't formulate. Don't write the big planning books. Devote your time to action and implementation and find out what happens. 4, pay more attention to structure than to strategy. Is there enough delegated judgment? Is your employee base empowered? Does knowledge flow backwards and sideways in your organization as it should? The priority is to work on the structure, not the strategy, to advance this adaptiveness. From all of this, Matt said, strategy emerges. Wow, that's an important word and a big concept. There's a lot of trusting and a lot of letting go of power and authority needed for strategy to emerge. On what basis can entrepreneurs develop the confidence to let strategy emerge? Dr. Matthew McCaffrey is back this week to assure us that there are solid principles behind the letting go of authoritative centralized strategizing. Matt teaches at the University of Manchester in England, and his economics doctorate is from the prestigious Université d'Angers, and his master's degree is from Auburn in the US. He teaches business and entrepreneurship and how firms succeed, and his research activities cover a broad span of businesses and innovative thinking about value, creativity, user communities, and decentralized organization. We'll get a flavor of all that and more today. Matt, welcome again to the Economics for Business podcast.
Thanks once again for having me. It's always a pleasure.
Well, last week you helped us develop the idea of Austrian business strategy, a distinctive approach to creating and growing successful firms. So it's firm-oriented strategy, serving customers, creating markets and creating value, managing capital allocations, creating advantage. And we summed that up as replacing the business school idea of strategy with a much more realistic approach of what you called exploration. And we did discuss that to a great extent. It's an approach that runs counter to the business convention. And today what we're going to do is enumerate the underlying principles for that approach to reinforce the point that while we're unconventional, we're based on established economic science. I was thinking about the right place to start and consider all the relevant principles. And one thing that came to mind, Matt, is entrepreneurs often tell me, Austrian economics just makes sense. It's logical. I can use it. It helps me explain the real world. And I think in the literature, that's often referred to as Austrian realism. So let's start there. Tell us about realism and whether I've got it right in terms of its applicability for entrepreneurs.
Well, going way back to the beginning of Austrian economics, Austrians have always been very concerned with a realistic approach to the subject, whether that was economics more broadly or looking more specifically at entrepreneurs and what they do. Realism has always been at the center of sort of Austrian research agendas, going even way back to Carl Menger, the founder. So this has always been an important theme, and the area of entrepreneurship and the firm and so on is one area where that emphasis really comes to light in a very important way. Because the more we study this, the more we begin to try to look into what entrepreneurs do, the further and further we get away from a lot of more conventional mainstream views of economics. And the more we get into this very distinct area that really the Austrians alone have carved out for themselves. Austrians aren't the only people who are interested in entrepreneurship and the firm, obviously, because those are major topics in economics, but they have approached them in a unique way. And realism is one crucial aspect of that unique Austrian approach. So, trying to figure out what entrepreneurial decision making looks like on a day to day basis and how individual entrepreneurs' decisions ultimately. Hopefully create value for consumers, or what happens when entrepreneurs fail to do that. These are the kind of crucial questions that Austrians tend to begin with. And then building on that, we try to look at sort of the bigger picture. How do all of these individual entrepreneurial actions ultimately compose a much larger market process? The market is a process, as Mises often used to say. It's not an end state. It's not a static state, or more just sort of one position or arrangement of resources in an economy. It's a constantly unfolding process that's persistently occurring all around us, even as we speak. So this is really where the Austrians have always started from, rather than trying to look at entrepreneurship or at competition or at innovation or the firm or whatever in some more static way or in a more abstract, unrealistic way, simply because it's easier to do that. That's a very common habit of the mainstream is to examine economic problems in quite abstract, unrealistic ways, because those are the ways that are the most tractable. They're the easiest, the cleanest. They're the easiest to formalize using mathematical methods and so on. But Austrians tend to veer sharply away from that because we want to know what happens in the real world, even if that's messy and difficult and complicated. Because for us, that's where all the real value is. That's where the true understanding comes from.
Yep. And some of that realism, Matt, I think is cause and effect realism, right? We try to understand what is the result of choosing certain means. Do we achieve the ends? That's cause and effect oriented. And a lot of our logic is kind of reverse logic. You talked about it last week in imputation. We look at what actually happened and say, what would have to be the case to cause that? So, am I right that cause and effect is at the core of this realism?
Again, quite correct. And once more, even if you go back to the very first line of the Principles of Economics by Carl Menger, that line is all things are subject to the law of cause and effect. So right at the beginning, right side by side with this notion of realism is the notion of cause and effect and reasoning about that and trying to discover how cause and effect work in the real world. Again, this might be contrasted with a more abstract method that treats all of the human beings and all of the decisions involved in, say, a more mathematical way where you have neatly defined variables and everything is defined in terms of everything else and so on. And the goal is to make a sort of a determinate system. But of course, in the real world, that's unfortunately not how things play out. And Austrians have always appreciated the complexity and the uncertainty and so forth that goes into all of these studying all of these kinds of problems. And again, right from the beginning, it was always a matter of cause and effect. Again, of studying the patterned way in which different economic phenomena, if you want to call them that, or the way that they influence each other. So going right back to Menger, and then further on through up through contemporary Austrians, there's always been this emphasis on figuring out these sometimes very long and complicated chains of cause and effect. And when we figure out patterns in cause and effect, that's when we begin to talk about economic principles or maybe even economic laws in the most extreme cases.
Now, one of our realistic principles is subjectivism or subjectivity, which sounds kind of touchy feely and imprecise. Uh, but in fact, it's a core piece of understanding in cause and effect analysis that individuals are subjective in their approach to decision making. You can't impose rules on all of them because they come from a subjective point of view. We're always talking about it, but Matt, help us a little bit about subjectivism, especially the subjectivism of the entrepreneur.
Again, if you really want to understand the entrepreneurial process, you really have to begin with subjectivism. Certainly, if you want to understand entrepreneurship in any kind of realistic way, you need to look at the subjective elements involved. Now, some of these are a little more obvious if you really think them through consistently. For example, we know that subjective consumer values are, in a sense, at the foundation of everything that happens in the economy, because ultimately it's those values that are going to help entrepreneurs figure out whether or not they're doing the right things. So some of those can be a little more obvious. However, some of the more difficult and complicated ones arise when we start thinking about the subjectivism of entrepreneurs. Right? And this relates to various topics that we covered in our previous episode, and that also you've covered in many other episodes over the course of the show. Looking at the way that entrepreneurs' unique or subjective valuations of all of the resources they have available to them, looking at the way that those affect the firm and the value of the business, and ultimately entrepreneurs' ability to serve consumers. Because essentially everything that entrepreneurs do within the business is going to depend on some kind of subjective valuation. It's going to depend on an entrepreneur seeing an interesting, maybe overlooked use for a resource. It's going to involve entrepreneurs correctly forecasting some kind of consumer preference for maybe a technology that doesn't even exist yet, but that could exist, that an entrepreneur is imagining will be created in the next few years. In any case, entrepreneurs' subjective valuations are constantly shaping businesses and shaping this relationship between the business firm and the consumer, which of course is what all of this is ultimately about. So subjectivity is everywhere in the economy, and it's not just consumer subjective values that are important. Entrepreneur subjective values are also absolutely crucial because, of course, they help explain what's going on behind the scenes on the business side, that whole part of the economic process that maybe consumers don't know about or that never even really get a chance to see.
But ultimately, the value that the entrepreneur is searching for, we say, is determined by the consumer. The consumer actually decides what is valuable. We think value is an experience in that sense. And we have this principle that, again, it sounds a bit clumsy, but we call it consumer sovereignty because the consumer determines what is valuable. So walk us through that step in the chain, Matt, the consumer sovereignty part.
Sure. So, one of the crucial aspects of looking at the entrepreneurial process is thinking about the issue of time and remembering that entrepreneurs are always having to plan in the present for production that's going to take place in the future. In other words, to ultimately try and satisfy consumers at some point in the future. Right? Production takes time because it takes time to assemble various production goods. It takes time to assemble human talents and put them together and cook them up in some kind of a recipe that will hopefully produce useful goods and services. But unfortunately, entrepreneurs can't predict the future. They don't know exactly what's going to be happening, years and years down the road sometimes. So what they're trying to do is guess now what consumers are going to want in the future. But of course, there's a sort of a mismatch here because consumers are typically experiencing their buying and selling decisions in the present. right? So, the present now, the consumption decisions we make today, in turn depend on entrepreneurial decisions that were made weeks, months, years, sometimes even decades ago, depending on what kind of goods and services we're talking about. So consumers, we say that they're sovereign in the economy because ultimately it's their decisions to buy or not to buy that determine which entrepreneurs make profits and which ones earn losses. So we say that they're sovereign for this reason, because if consumers decide not to buy, then there's really nothing an entrepreneur can do about that. Well, you might try and rejig your product, you might try taking a different marketing approach, and so forth. But at the end of the day, if consumers don't want to buy your product, then you're going to be earning losses as an entrepreneur, and ultimately you might go bankrupt. So in this sense, consumers really are we could call the driving force of the economy. Usually we say that's entrepreneurs, but what we ultimately mean is that at the end of the day, it's consumers who are going to be deciding which entrepreneurs profit and which ones go bankrupt. So this is what we mean by consumer sovereignty. It's a way of talking about how consumers have the final say in who runs the businesses in an economy, who's an entrepreneur, and who the most successful entrepreneurs are going to be. And furthermore, consumer sovereignty also implies that consumers have the final say on who is going to own the means of production, who's going to own land, labor, capital, and so forth, because those resources only have value to the extent that they create valuable things for consumers. So if consumers decide that goods and services produced by the factors of production aren't actually good, if they're not worth buying, then the value of those resources falls, sometimes even to zero, and their ownership is going to have to be rearranged amongst entrepreneurs. So consumer sovereignty has many profound impacts beyond just basic issues of what happens to appear on the supermarket shelves on a day-to-day basis. It goes far back to that, all the way up through what we call the structure of production in the economy, and all those different factors of production that entrepreneurs are constantly buying and selling and adjusting and manipulating it as a part of their business plans. But all of this finally comes down to the consumer, right? Entrepreneurs can't just buy and sell and arrange the factors of production however they please, because the very value of those resources depends on what consumers think, right? And as people like Mises used to point out, in the market economy, it's the consumers who are king. It's the consumers who are sovereign in that sense.
Yeah, Mises has this great visual that I always think about, that the entrepreneurs at the wheel of the ship trying to point it in the direction of value, and he's probably calling down to the engine room about which way to go and how much speed on the engines. But ultimately, the consumer's the captain. If the consumer says you're pointing it in the wrong direction, then it's the consumer who's in charge. So I like that visual. So the consumer sovereignty that you've described, Matt, takes us to an issue of forecasting, which I think is one of the places where both Austrian entrepreneurship and Austrian economics departs from the mainstream a little bit. Economists are always trying to forecast. They're always trying to tell us what's going to happen in the next quarter, in the next decade. And businesses do that. They write plans to say we're going to sell 1,253,412 cases next year. And it turns out that forecasting is a little bit more difficult. And maybe, tell me if I'm right or wrong, you can't do it at all because of this subjectivism of consumers and the fact that they might change their minds, and you just don't know how they're going to behave in the future. So can we forecast at all?
Well, sometimes we can forecast, and this is a little bit tricky. As I sort of implied a moment ago, this combination of time, which introduces uncertainty, and then also all these other changeable factors about the world, whether it's changing consumer tastes or developing technologies, all of these things are uncertain, maybe even radically uncertain. So they introduce this extremely difficult element of forecasting into the entrepreneurial process. And what we've learned from a sad experience, especially with sort of mainstream macroeconomics and so on, is that forecasting is really impossible to do on any sort of large scale or systematic scale, particularly when you want to talk about forecasting large economic organizations or areas. For instance, forecasting the economic future of the United States economy, something like this. So we've learned through harsh experience that this sort of thing is essentially impossible to do, at least according to any kind of rule or according to any kind of formal model, because every time economists even think that they've figured it out, they tend to get a rude awakening. And of course, the one of the more recent examples would be the financial crisis earlier, a decade or more ago, which, of course, mainstream macroeconomics completely failed to forecast and anticipate. So that's the difficult part of forecasting. It's always a challenge, but it can be done to some extent. And we see this play out in the case of individual entrepreneurs. So, what individual entrepreneurs are doing is also trying to forecast the future. They're trying to figure out these patterns of consumption, trying to figure out what consumers are want and how much they're going to be willing to pay for what they want and so forth. And once again, it's always difficult. It's always a minefield, and we see entrepreneurs fail, right? And we know from various studies over the years that so oftentimes the vast majority of new businesses will fail within the first, say, 5 years, right? How many or what proportion, this depends on exactly how you measure and so forth. But we know that the number is very high in any case. Right? So entrepreneurs do get it wrong. However, there are some exceptional entrepreneurs who do seem to get it right and who are very good at doing what we call the piercing the fog of Knightian uncertainty, which is sort of a pretentious way of putting that. But the idea is, the uncertain future is sort of like a fog. It's very hazy, very difficult to see through. And yet some entrepreneurs are exceptionally good at that. And they prove this by their ability to consistently earn profits and build successful, sustainable businesses in the marketplace. So it's not impossible, but it is extraordinarily difficult, especially to do systematically over any significant period of time. And that's one of the things that we're trying to figure out as we study entrepreneurs is exactly what it is that they do that allows some of them to be successful and what it is that some people get so right and others get so wrong.
A quick note. Did you know that we provide supplemental materials for each podcast? Listening to and understanding the key takeaways from our expert guests helps you think better about building a more beautiful business. Taking direct action and implementing these strategies is when the real work begins. Take a concrete, immediate step to implementing a better business model today by downloading the show notes and business tool we've created for this episode. Visit Mises.org/E4Bpod. That's MISES.org/E, the number 4, the letter B, POD, and click on today's episode. Now, back to our interview.
Yeah, I like the Jeff Bezos quote there, Matt, where he said that I know that consumers are never going to say, stop making it cheaper. And they're never going to say, stop getting it to me faster. And they're never going to say, make the quality lower. And so I think he's saying that there are certain market drivers that you can count on if you really understand your consumers. And then he experiments to find out which of the combinations of cheap and fast and high quality get the most resonance in the marketplace. So that those kinds of drivers are a little bit of a forecast, right, or a prediction or projection into the future. So you can do that to some extent.
That's correct. And I think one of the crucial aspects that you raise with these examples of things like lower prices, higher quality, and so on, is that they relate to more general patterns in consumer preferences. So rather than being highly specific examples of a very say, technical or nuanced qualities of goods that people want to buy. They're really just general characteristics of all goods and services that tend to attract consumers' attention. So I think that's one reason why it's useful to think in those terms, is because those kinds of categories like low prices are just general enough that they tend to apply across virtually all goods and services. And so, in that sense, they have a value to entrepreneurs, and also in a sense they're easier to figure out sometimes because, as you say, there's a sort of consistency to them. We know that consumers are going to tend to want low prices versus high prices, right? Generally speaking. So, given that we know that, it's a little easier for entrepreneurs to use that information and to take action based on it rather than far more detailed or explicit predictions about exactly what people are going to want at any particular time and place.
Yeah, and within that, I think you can find then a set of consumers and a set of problems to solve, as we often call it, that are within those general drivers are specific to a specific group at a specific time in a specific place. So last week, or a couple of weeks ago, in episode 126, Joe Matarese was talking about the medical staffing industry and specific problems to solve in that market. A tiny sliver of economic activity in that sense, and very precise and individual consumers that he could identify with a problem to solve within those characteristics of price, quality, convenience, and so on. So I think there's a method, right, to entrepreneurs solving those problems.
Yes, we could call it that. It's difficult to characterize exactly, precisely because of this issue of uncertainty, and also because of the vast differences between individual entrepreneurs and the way that they approach their problems. But I suppose, in a sense, we could identify a kind of entrepreneurial method and some common traits in the way that entrepreneurs go about doing what they do. For instance, we know that entrepreneurs need to make good use of scarce and highly specific production goods, highly specific factors of production, land, labor, and capital. We know that this is a common thread throughout all entrepreneurship. So we could include that as a sort of a step or a part of maybe this broader method, the need to apply scarce, highly specific production goods to solving very specific problems entrepreneurs imagine that they see out there in the world. These sorts of things are crucial for what we could call the entrepreneurial method. Likewise, there are many themes relating to things like properly making use of dispersed or tacit knowledge that's floating around in the economy that could be helpful in figuring out what consumers might want in the near or in the distant future. All of these things can be related typically to or we can gain some insight into them by making the best use we can of all of this dispersed and tacit knowledge that's constantly sort of circulating in the economy. Now, having that knowledge and making good use of it, obviously, that doesn't solve the problem of entrepreneurship because, once again, the economy, it's not a formula, right? It's not an equation where we can simply plug in all the information that's available to us as long as we can gather it, and it spits out an optimal entrepreneurial solution. It's not like that. The future is uncertain, and again, it's a process that unfolds in time. But once more, we could think about the way that entrepreneurs approach these problems and some of the necessary tasks they have to accomplish, and using dispersed and tacit knowledge, I think, is a good example of a very common theme in entrepreneurship and a very common part of this process of being a successful entrepreneur.
Yeah, I'm going to press that just a little bit, Matt, because I like to call that a method that an entrepreneur is constantly gathering this dispersed knowledge. He or she knows that there's kind of more of it out there, and they've got to keep learning. We call it a learning process. And then also adaptiveness. The modern words become pivot. Every time you get a new piece of information, you pivot on it. You use it in a certain way. You change things. You called it last week the combination and recombination of heterogeneous capital goods, which is another way of saying, hey, keep learning, keep changing. And that we could call that a method, I think. Or am I pushing it too far?
No, I think in that sense in which you're using it, we could call it a method. The only thing I worry about is comparing it too much to, for example, to the scientific method, or trying to imply that entrepreneurship is always just a very simple, straightforward process of, say, collecting information, combining resources, and figuring out optimal solutions to problems. So, of course, that's not, I think, what how we view entrepreneurship.
Mhm.
And I always just try and emphasize, as I do, to my students and the other academics I talk to about this, always try to emphasize just how difficult and open ended and uncertain the whole process is, as a way to to play up as much as possible the complexities and the difficulties of making decisions as an entrepreneur, and just avoiding this sort of simplistic view that sometimes you get from mainstream economics or even some entrepreneurship research, that looks at entrepreneurship in a much more mechanical way, as a sort of an engineering problem to be solved. As long as we sort of have a good entrepreneurial experiment and we run the experiment over and over and over again, eventually we figure out what the correct method is. It would be great if the world worked that way, but unfortunately, it's not. So if I don't use the word method, it's only to avoid conflating the entrepreneurial method with more scientific methods like that. But I think what you're describing is an entrepreneurial method or an entrepreneurial process that very much draws on these realistic insights that we've gleaned from economics, and that really do describe how entrepreneurs behave, and the methods they use to do what they do.
Yeah. Well, of course, you're right. I don't want to press it too far. In my head, it's the opposite of the scientific method. You're not running experiments to find out results. You're just constantly changing to see what changes emerge from that behavior. But so let's not call it a method. Let's go to another word and another principle that we use a lot, and maybe you can relate it to what has gone before. And we talk about judgment. Judgment is very central to the Austrian view of entrepreneurship, and that's another word that's not entirely clear. So, in the spirit of realism, how do you explain judgment to business people, Matt?
So, judgment can be a little bit difficult to unpack, again, because of this issue of subjectivity that I mentioned. So many entrepreneurs do things in slightly different ways, sometimes in radically different ways. So, it can be hard to capture what all of them do. But I think judgment is a very good term for that. I think it really does the job better than any other term that we have. But when we're talking about judgment, we're talking about what we do when we're confronted with uncertainty. Right? Again, because of the uncertain future, we're constantly, even in our everyday lives, to say nothing of being entrepreneurs, we're constantly confronted with the need to make decisions right now. So when we talk about judgment, we're talking about how we make decisions in the face of uncertainty, and all of the little tools, tricks, information, heuristics, and so on that we use to go about making those decisions when there isn't a strict rule or a formula that we could follow. And that's really a crucial issue when talking about judgment and entrepreneurship, is that we talk about judgment when we don't have easy decision rules available to us, when there aren't convenient, optimal solutions that we can just tease out by putting everything into a nice, neat formula. Right? Of course, people who are paying attention would realize that this isn't just entrepreneurial decision making. That's actually a description of basically all of the
Mhm.
decision making we do in everyday life, because
Yeah,
uncertainty is everywhere, not just for entrepreneurs. But entrepreneurs have to bear uncertainty in this very specific way, because they're putting, they're hazarding their own resources in the marketplace. So they're bearing uncertainty through their judgment, which is something that many other people don't do, or they don't do to the same extent. But in any case, to get back to what judgment is, when we talk about it, again, it's kind of a grab bag. It can mean, you can think about it in a lot of different ways, including a kind of intuition that entrepreneurs have. That's how many real world entrepreneurs describe it. Others have used expressions like gut feeling, that sort of instinctual feeling that one move is the right one and another one is the wrong one. Entrepreneurs have many different ways of describing their own experience of judgment. But I think judgment is a good umbrella term that really captures all of this. And as they say, sometimes it's knowledge, sometimes it's a hunch, sometimes it's a feeling in your gut, sometimes you're using a sort of personal subjective heuristic that you've set up to help guide you through the decision making process. So there's lots of different ways to think about it, but what they all have in common is that it is a personal way, of a subjective way of assessing a problem in the world and trying to figure out how to assemble the right resources in the right place and time in order to deal with that problem.
So here's a critical principle, Matt, emerging from that. It's a quote from your book, Austrian Perspectives on Entrepreneurship, Strategy, and Organization. You co-wrote it with Peter Klein and Nikolai Foss, who are colleagues of ours in this whole Economics for Business project. Let me read it. Differences in firm performance boils down to entrepreneurs differing in how well they exercise judgment and delegate judgment. So judgment, as you've just described it, is the critical factor between success and not success, right?
That's correct. It's a crucial and defining aspect of entrepreneurship and also of the firm as well, because entrepreneurs in a business context often act through firms. In a sense, although not all entrepreneurs start firms, all firms do require entrepreneurs to be, to be founded, to be run, and so on. So entrepreneurs are often acting through firms in the economy, and it's through this characteristic of entrepreneurial decision making, of successful judgment, that some firms succeed and stand out and last in the long run, and others don't. So we could look at this whole judgment concept as a crucial explanation of lots of different important things that are going on in the economy, the founding of firms, how they're run on a day-to-day basis, and sort of how they innovate and plan for the future, etc. How they strategize, as we discussed last week. But really, it all comes back to this notion of entrepreneurial decision making. And you mentioned both making good judgments and delegating judgments. And that second part is crucial as well, because it's not always entrepreneurs as the owners and the ultimate decision makers in a firm. It's not always they who are going to be making the day to day decisions in any given business. Often that responsibility is delegated to what we could call proxy entrepreneurs. Or use another term for describing people within firms who are delegated decision-making authority by the entrepreneur. Now, within a firm, the entrepreneur is always sort of at the top. Whether it's an individual entrepreneur or a team of entrepreneurs, they are going to be the ultimate decision makers. And so, if they wanted to, they could step in and make all the day-to-day decisions, or they could micromanage everyone, further down in the firm. But very often they don't. And it's about striking that balance and trying to figure out the right amount to delegate and to whom to delegate and so forth. That is a crucial aspect of being an entrepreneur and a crucial aspect of determining whether or not a firm is successful. Knowing, the right time and place and the right people to delegate to. Both of those aspects of judgment, actually making decisions in the face of uncertainty and knowing when to delegate decisions in the face of uncertainty to other people in your firm. Both of those are crucial aspects of entrepreneurship, and they both play an absolutely vital role in determining whether or not firms are actually successful and profitable.
Yeah, and let me underline a principle there, and maybe you can comment on it. We like to contrast the Austrian approach to the traditional business school approach, and business schools talk about building competitive advantage. And as we mentioned last week, they have tools to help us do that. The SWOT tools and the 5 forces and all of those kinds of things. But we don't think of competitive advantage. We think of exercising judgment in the state of uncertainty, and some do it better than others. It's not competitive advantage. It's the market process. It's the entrepreneurial approach, if you won't let me use the word method. It's exercising judgment, not building competitive advantage. I think those are different.
That's correct. And competitive advantage, especially, can often be associated in a lot of, say, mainstream management writings with, again, this more objective mechanical approach to thinking about entrepreneurship or firm performance, profitability, whichever way you want to look at it, because competitive advantage lends itself very easily to thinking of things in objective terms. For instance, in one view where the secret to competitive advantage is having um, valuable or unique resources, for instance. Oftentimes, these sorts of things are treated in a very objective way. You know, a resource is either valuable or it's not. And whether it is or not is sort of given to us as entrepreneurs. But of course, in the judgment based view, we don't look at things that way at all. We have to look at resources as um, fundamentally subjective. Right? Some entrepreneurs perceive a value or a use for resources that other entrepreneurs don't perceive. And in any case, entrepreneurs are constantly having their judgments, their estimations, their perceptions checked by the reality of the market, by the reality of what consumers actually want. Right? So, in this sense, something like a resource isn't objectively given. It can't be objectively defined. It really depends entirely on what consumers ultimately think, which is going to be transmitted to entrepreneurs through the profit and loss system. So this is a much more dynamic approach, the judgment-based view. It's a much more dynamic approach to thinking about the entrepreneurial problem, and a much more subjective one because it acknowledges that none of this information about, say, what a valuable resource is or about any other source of competitive advantage, none of it is objectively given to us. It's all subjective, and we have to always constantly interpret it in terms of what consumers want, and trying to figure out that problem.
Yes, and that can be captured in the concept of discovery. We're not all knowing, we're not forecasting, we're discovering. And I equate that to marketing. Peter Drucker said there are only two useful activities of the firm. One is innovation and one is marketing. And I think based on the principles you've just enunciated, Matt, we can define marketing as the dynamic, to use that word, discovery, second word, of ways to serve customers better. And that's how we outperform our rivals. We serve customers better than they do, and it's dynamic discovery.
I think that's correct. And I think it fits nicely, actually, with even a lot of conventional definitions of marketing. You know, for instance, the marketing as the process of discovering and satisfying consumers and so on. You see very similar types of definitions in the literature. So I think this is actually quite a useful place where we can point to some overlap between more Austrian flavored views and more conventional mainstream views of marketing, because they're really not that different. And in fact, in many ways, if you look at mainstream definitions of marketing, they sound a lot like Austrian definitions of entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial competition. So I think there's actually quite a lot of fertile ground there. It's not something that very many people have written on thus far, but I do think it's a really promising area for us to explore because I think there's a lot of genuine common ground there and a lot of opportunities, if I could use that word, to exploit some gains from trade between these different disciplines. Because even though we often have different emphases or maybe use different terminology, at the end of the day, we are often, as Austrians, saying very similar things to what a lot of mainstream marketers are saying.
Yeah, one of our underlying themes, I think, Matt, and something Per Byland said was there's a lot of business people out there, entrepreneurs, who are unconscious or subconscious Austrians because they're exercising a lot of these entrepreneurial principles. They just don't combine it with the idea of Austrian economics. And maybe that marketing, as you said, is one place where we can bring out the unconscious Austrianism in everybody. One last point, we've talked about organizational design, and we're going to cover that in another episode. It's really important, but too long for the time we have left. But one of the areas that business schools have spent some time on and focused on a little bit is the culture of the firm and cultivating shared values. And overtly managing that, creating a culture or fostering a culture. But we would tend to say, I think, that that's not something the entrepreneur can do. If you're delegating judgment, you're making some communication of what you called last week rules, but you're not telling people what to do, just giving them guidance, that culture and values emerge in the firm. Is that a fair point?
Yes, I think so. I think the main issue is that for a culture or a series of shared values within a company to really take hold and to really work, it has to be organic in a sense. It has to sort of naturally emerge within the firm. If you try too much to control it or to plan it from the top down, it ends up being counterproductive, or you end up with a sort of an intended culture and an actual firm that are somehow incongruous and just don't really fit together. Whereas the more successful stories about this have allowed their, if you want to call it corporate cultures, to develop a little more organically or spontaneously, maybe, as opposed to trying to micromanage them from the top down. And, people like Peter Klein and Nikolai Foss have talked about encouraging, as you pointed out, providing sort of a general guidance within the firm as far as rules and culture and so on are concerned, and essentially giving people a framework within which they can act, and through which many different people across the firm, separated in time and space, can try and figure out what a common culture would look like, and try and figure out the sort of company we are, if you want to put it that way. But this is something that is very difficult to pull off effectively if you're a lone CEO trying to impose it all from the top down. And there are a lot of horror stories and cliches out there about businesses that tried to just uproot existing culture overnight and replace it with a sort of neat prepackaged culture. This has become something of a kind of a running joke in management studies about the corporate retreat, where we just develop, we overnight plan out a new corporate culture that we're going to introduce to the company, that's going to transform our vision and values and so forth. So I think it's relatively well understood now that this is not the kind of thing that you can really do, despite what management consultants will tell you, that they, what they can accomplish as long as you pay them enough money. The truth is that we can't really just seamlessly craft completely new corporate cultures to put into our organizations whenever we want. It's really something that does evolve over time, and it tends to evolve, I think, more successfully and healthily if it's has a certain degree of guidance without excessive planning and micromanaging, and if there is a sort of evolutionary or spontaneous aspect to the way that culture grows.
Well, Matt, thank you. That's a good place to end. We're up against the clock here a little bit. So thank you for summarizing in a logical way the principles that we think underlie the Austrian approach to business strategy. We'll summarize them in our key takeaways and the infographic that we provide each week. And we'll point people who are interested to your book, Austrian Perspectives on Entrepreneurship, Strategy, and Organization, because all of those principles are included there. And we'll talk about organizational design another time. We look forward to that. So, Matt, thank you very, very much.
Thank you, as always, for having me on. It's always a great time. It's just so exciting to be able to talk about these ideas and, get them out to the world a little bit more.
Good. Well, we thank you for your role in that.
Economics for Business is a production of the Mises Institute. To explore more content like this, visit Mises.org. And for more from Hunter Hastings, visit hunterhastings.com.